if you would join us.
How are you feeling? Your latest workups on your condition indicate that all damage has been reversed. Recovery is total. I believe you have been quite fortunate. No further thanks are necessary, Commander, but you are most welcome. It is my function and pleasure as a medical droid to help and heal human beings.
I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
All right, welcome back to the Bacta Tank. I am Michael, and in this episode, we are going to be diving into Andor Season 2, episodes 4 through 6, what many are already calling the series' next great narrative pivot, marked by its second major time skip and a tonal shift reminiscent of the show's first season. This arc plunges us into a web of deception, idealism, and ideological divergence across 3 planets: Gorman, Coruscant, and Dakar. Is that how you'd say that third planet? Dakar.
Dakar, yeah.
All right, and the episode's written by Beau Willimon, who also penned the mid-season One Way Out arc last year. These episodes largely reflect Andor's continued commitment to a meditative type of storytelling that fractures conventional binaries of good and evil. So rather than building toward explosive action beats, the show leans into tension as a narrative engine. The characters don't merely push the story forward, but they embody its contradictions, and each one is caught in a different version of what rebellion ought to be. And they do this through a lens of duality or binaries, dual binaries, and not in the traditional sense. And we're going to break this down throughout our discussion. And it's an interesting way for Tony Gilroy to still adhere to the binaries that shape the Star Wars universe, meaning good versus evil, but deconstructing them down to more nuanced political thought.
Yeah, I think that basically one of the clarifications should be he does something that basically makes the argument of good versus evil and breaks it down to just not good versus evil, but right and wrong.
And also how good and evil are both can be fractured down into ambiguity. Really, that is the genius of this entire series from the beginning to this very moment. At the heart of these episodes is a shifting sense of positionality. You have Syril, once a failed corporate enforcer, is now embedding, himself deep within a rebel cell. So now we know his purpose. That's something we talked about in great detail during our last discussion. What is his point? What is his purpose? And he does seem to be still kind of a useful idiot.
I was about to say his point is to be Daedra's whipping boy.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad point to have.
It's not a bad point.
If someone said, "Hey, would you like to be Daedra's whipping boy?" Yes,
I would say yes.
Yes, please. Yes. As long as she wears that black gown with the perfectly straightened, shiny blonde hair.
Yes.
And when I walk into our quarters, she tells me to turn the lights off.
Turn the lights off.
That's fine.
You
I'm
need
okay
to just
that.
turn around, turn off the lights, whatever you say.
Please.
Please.
And then we have Cassian posing as a fashion designer, and he straddles the performance, or I should say he straddles performance and authenticity, much like Luthen.
Yeah.
Which in itself is a bit of a, when you put it on that much and you are forced to perform in a way that's completely not you, it's completely a break of character, which we know Andor is the farthest thing from a performer.
Mm-hmm.
That in itself requires a type of psychological and physical energy that can deplete someone. And that shows you a certain aspect of espionage and war that we haven't always been privy to in television shows and movies. The weight of the performance itself. What does the performative nature of rebellion do to a psyche? You lose sight of who you are.
Yeah. And that in itself is actually now we're getting to that point where we need to find Cassian by the time Rogue One comes along. It's like what we were talking about in the prior episode of where the destination for Cassian has to go by the end of the series. And having him go through this where we get to see him start doing more Luthen things where he's more performative. And just like you said, he's starting to lose his soul.
He's losing his soul. He's losing his identity. We saw that as well with Vel and Cinta.
Yes.
Vel herself admitted to Cinta that she was confused. She was losing herself. And I don't want to say she was blaming Luthen and the rebellion necessarily, but it goes to show you the fractured identities that war create through the act of performance, deceit. These things are a mental, moral, and psychological cost on the individual. And you see that with Luthen, you see that with Mon Mothma. And ultimately, that all just plays right into the grand theme of what Andor really is about. And it's about the cost of not just rebellion, but the cost of war.
Yeah. And on top of that, all of that, quote unquote, I guess you could say madness destroys a character, and it leads to a character like Saw Gerrera, where Gerrera he's the end result where it's like he's been driven insane. And then like
he is the warning to the Mothmas, to the Luthens, the Andors. This very well could end up being you.
This set of episodes made me really love the character of Saw Gerrera, not in an admiral way, I guess you could say, where we look up to him, but it reminded me how complex this character is that we got introduced to in like Clone Wars and Rebels, especially when you start with those shows that were geared for kids. You get this hint of Saw Gerrera is this charismatic leader, but he's also not to be trusted because he's insane. His methodology is so radical. It's kind of like I started thinking back to it, like in Rebels, Ezra was warned, don't trust Saw. He's a very dangerous individual. But during that whole arc, you see Ezra is very drawn to him because he believes in what Gerrera is saying. But by the end of it, you realize, oh my God, I can't follow this guy because he is insane. And then now we flash forward to here in Andor, and it just comes out fully in your face, where throughout the entire time of this character's history, it's always just hinted at what he truly is like. And Tony Gilroy basically says, no. This is the time that we get to see Saw Gerrera at his most insane, where it's great to actually look at those figures of the olden days, I guess you could say, of like great speakers and people who talk and are charismatic and you want to follow them. But then you get to actually see, holy crap, these people are insane. Like a character as charismatic as Saw Gerrera is just as dangerous as the Death Star.
It goes to show you that good people could do bad things and bad people can do good things.
Exactly.
Saw Gerrera is a bad person.
Yeah, he's a bad person.
He's a bad person fighting for a good cause. That's the genius of Rogue One as well as Andor
series.
And just to piggyback onto your point, that's also largely what this episode is doing. So across the entire arc, the rebellion is not a singular cause, but a fragmented movement, and is fueled by trauma, suspicion, and competing visions of freedom. And what holds it together isn't trust, but necessity. That is so intriguing and incredibly accurate in terms of real world politics, or I should say real world wartime politics.
There you go.
So there's a rich reading to be made ultimately about the way Andor fractures Star Wars traditional moral binary through its focus on character pairings. That's something that we definitely saw come to the forefront in this specific episode, is how each character is paired. And it's very interesting to see how Tony Gilroy is actively deconstructing the typical binaries that we've come to understand or expect about Star Wars, particularly the Manichaean duality of good and evil. And the reason why I want to bring this up before we get into the main plot specifics is because this Star Wars series is deconstructing what has bound Star Wars as an IP since its conception, which is the clear moral stance between good and evil. This is a great example. Andor is a great example of how to work within an established IP where the writers for The Acolyte flatten foundational binaries into a type of simplistic, almost Marxist style oppressor versus oppressed framework, which does not work in Star Wars.
Yeah.
That's not an indictment on Marxism, if that's your thing. That's an indictment on it just doesn't work in the world of Star Wars. So whereas you had Acolyte flatten those binaries, Andor complicates those same binaries, interrogating ideology, complicity, and the moral cost of resistance. And this is largely done through utilitarian means. And we'll get into what that exactly means in a moment. Basically, it's a form of consequentialism where the ends justifies the means.
Yes.
So my point is that rather than throwing out the rule book, which is what a lot of people seem to want to do in today's landscape of movies and TV, David, it's something we talk about a lot because we're in an IP game. IPs from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and they're trying to recontextualize these IPs in ways that don't work with the source material. And what happens is you end up breaking what makes that IP the IP. So rather than doing that, Gilroy maintains what works, and his team actually redeploy those same binaries into relational dynamics that interrogate the power structures beneath them. So rather than presenting clear-cut division between good and evil, the series, and particularly these episodes, which were just genius level type of dissection, explores how individuals, institutions, and entire systems perpetuate oppression and complicity. We see this in the characters we meet in Andor because they are not presented as purely heroic, nor wholly villainous. Dedra, I would not consider completely evil, nor Syril. In fact, I would argue Syril's probably a better person than Saw Gerrera in a lot of ways. Syril is about rule of law.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing in itself. He believes in the Empire, but he doesn't know what the Empire is doing.
Exactly.
And you see that very clearly now presented to us in the episode when Dedra's supervisor, I always forget his name, or reminds her that Syril cannot know the true purpose of this mission. But also, wouldn't you say what Luthen is doing is also a form of propaganda? Because again, the ends justifies the means.
Exactly.
When Andor clearly understands that something's not right on Gorman, and he tells Luthen accurately that this isn't what it seems, and Luthen decides to shrug and disagree with Andor and send other people there, what does he say when Andor says, what's going to happen when this blows up in your face? And he says, well, Gorman will shine ever so brightly, meaning that their destruction will essentially serve as a beacon to rally the rebel cause. So even if a planet is led into destruction, it's okay because in the end, it will serve the greater purpose of the rebel alliance or the rebel agenda.
And essentially, it's interesting to me that basically, like, Luthen takes that stance, and it's almost kind of like the philosophical argument when people say some people just want to watch the world burn. Luthen wants to watch the world burn because he believes so much in what he's doing is the right cause. It's a way of weaponizing that propaganda and that ideology.
And it's a form of consequentialism. These characters are often caught in a web of moral ambiguities. So bringing it back to why this works in Andor, as opposed to, say, something like the Acolyte. While Star Wars has historically operated on a mythic axis of light and dark, Jedi and Sith, Empire and Rebellion, Andor actually destabilizes many of those frameworks by presenting us not with archetypal duels, but with dyads that mirror, echo, and complicate each other across ideological and emotional lines. So these adversarial pairings, in the traditional sense, they're relational, they're contingent, and often defined by codependence or mutual manipulation.
Yes.
For example, you have Syril and Dedra. They're not master and apprentice or hero and villain. They're co-conspirators trapped in a dynamic that is as exploitive as it is functional. Luthen and Clea, neither is framed as morally upright. Both are willing to instrumentalize others for the sake of a greater but increasingly abstract good.
Yes.
That's what's really interesting, is that there is no definitive good. It's abstract. You can also say evil has now been placed into the abstract. It's actually now smart in a lot of ways, David, and I agree with not including Vader into a series like this.
Yeah.
Even though we know he's present, I think it serves the story's purpose, the narrative purpose, to keep those clear characters, those clearly defined moral characters or lack of moral characters in the area of the abstract when it comes to Andor. Bringing those definitive lines of good and evil will actually dirty, muddy up, and confuse the stories that much more. Now, by the end, we can see maybe a more cleaner, pure rebel alliance, possibly. That's something that Rogue One had already done some work on. They clearly created distinction between Saw Gerrera's rebels and Mon Mothma's rebels.
Yes.
So there is that distinction there. And this dualistic pattern repeats across the arc. But you know what's ultimately intriguing about this entire strategy is that in doing this, Andor, the series, correctly replaces Star Wars's moral clarity with something murkier.
Yes.
This is how you deconstruct an IP the correct way. Because when you replace the moral clarity with politics of entanglement, where revolutionaries and Imperials alike are driven by fear, ambition, trauma.
Yes.
And this type of duality, breaking from the norms of Star Wars, they don't function as moral symbols, but as relational mirrors. So it's not just that the traditional binary good and evil is fractured, it's that the show suggests such binaries are themselves a kind of narrative convenience, meaning the show removes the romanticized notions of rebellion and replaces it with something more nuanced, incredibly complicated, and never perfect.
It's one of those things that one of the thematic elements in Star Wars that Gilroy honestly is tapping into. I mean, like, if you think about it, that whole notion you just brought up harkens back to, say, the end of Revenge of the Sith, where, you know, you have Obi-Wan and Anakin screaming at each other that, oh, well, the Emperor is evil. And then Anakin basically tells him, well, I believe the Jedi are evil. Like blending those lines of good and evil. Or even recent times, one of the series, on a side note, that I really liked, when you get to the twist in the end, is Skeleton Crew, where you find out that whole planet has been controlled by this propaganda machine to believe that, oh, you're doing this is the right thing to do. It's for your benefit, and we're doing it for your own, peace. And in the end, it's like, no, that entire planet was being used for nefarious means, and the people didn't even know.
Yeah. Bringing it back to that point you made about Obi-Wan and Anakin.
Yeah.
When Anakin said, in his opinion, the Jedi are evil. Now, okay, that again is using the more simple binary of good versus evil. Now, a more complicated version of that was actually used in these episodes. And we saw this in the conversation between Mon Mothma and director Krennic. I don't think we've ever had a dialectic like this before put in Star Wars. And unfortunately, we weren't privy to all of it because it was more background.
Yes.
It was being used as a way to create suspense so that Clea can dismantle the listening device from the art piece.
Yes.
So we didn't get to hear all of it. But if you rewind it and listen to the back and forth, it is genius between Mon Mothma and Krennic. And some of the moments that they did allow us to hear by bringing it to the forefront was something that is deeply connected to, from my opinion, or in my opinion, the Jedi are evil. When Krennic says to Mon Mothma, "Oh, our terrorists are your rebels." That right there shows how there are always two sides to war.
Yeah.
Now, again, this is not to say the Empire is on the same level as the rebellion. We get that there is a clear difference in a lot of ways. We understand that. But again, this is something we talked about in Rebels, that sometimes people are born on one side of an imaginary line. Yeah. And on that other side of the imaginary line is a way of life, a way of politics, a way of ideology that you are born within. Just like Dedra, in a lot of ways, I feel like that was purposely included in the episode when she said that she was raised on the Imperial Kinder block. She's a product of her upbringing, of her environment. So you have that moment between Mon Mothma and Krennic where it clearly says, our terrorists are your rebels. He's showing that there's two sides, that you're claiming these are rebels. Well, we're claiming they're terrorists. They're enacting an ideological warfare on a rightful, for all they know, a rightful government.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing I thought. And the way that actually Tony Gilroy handled all these notions, I really enjoy seeing from a narrative standpoint, because he doesn't, the one problem I always say, especially in a lot of other shows that me and you have covered, people have tried to do this type of storytelling where you blur the lines, you change up the way people think. And the problem nowadays is a lot of people just want to shove it in your face, and they want to make the statement right away and just leave it there. Tony Gilroy, though, looks at this, and just like you said, if you didn't pay attention to that conversation, you're more, the audience is more focused on Clea trying to get the job done, right? But if you actually see the context of the scene, that's where the subtlety and the nuance, and shows how good the writing staff is to let this scene play out and get their statement out by not taking away too much from the show. They don't stop the show.
I will say this, just to change the direction of the conversation for a moment. I will say that the actor that plays Krennic, not only did he age quite a bit, even though he's supposed to be younger.
He's supposed to be younger.
He talks like he has marbles in his mouth now. Have you noticed that? Did he get his teeth done? Is that what it is? He sounds like Nancy Pelosi. Like there's just a lot of spit and a lot of like stuff in his mouth. I
think that's on a side note also, this is the problem with actually trying to do
prequels,
a prequel, because if you think about it, people age and our voices change. Everyone thinks that basically Mark Hamill still sounds like Mark Hamill when he was 20 years old. And it's like, no. If you actually listen, that's why, it's tough to actually, for actors like that to keep playing their characters again and again and again, if you expect them to be young.
Yeah.
It's the problem with, Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones for so long.
Oh, you know what? No, that is a good point, David.
That is a good
because even in the last Indiana Jones film, that was pretty good.
It was. I enjoyed it.
There was moments where he was running around in those early moments.
And you hear it in the voice.
And not just the voice. You see his body. He moves like an old man. But just because you put a young face
Or you
make
can
him suddenly
CGI it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, because
doesn't
there's moments where he
necessarily
was swinging and running. And I'm like, okay,
Oh, God.
that's an 80-year-old man's body.
Oh yeah, it's a great. It looks like Grandpa,
quite
like
obvious.
Going, wee! And
Yeah.
you're like, oh, but God, please don't break a hip.
Yeah, it's like when we watch Samuel L. Jackson play Nick Fury, and we forget that Samuel L. Jackson is nearly 90, and we don't realize. I'm joking, but he's a lot older than we think because the guy ages incredibly well. But where you notice his age is in his body movement.
Yes,
He can't do action. He is stiff as fuck.
Oh yeah,
Now, I will say, David, where I don't want to get into this whole, I don't want to toss stones at Gilroy because he's done a great job. But this is the point, David. When you do a good job with everything else, little things like replacing a legacy character for no reason whatsoever doesn't piss you off as much.
Yeah.
Does it get under my skin that they replace Jimmy Smits with Benjamin Bratt?
Benjamin Bratt.
Yeah, it does get under my skin, but I'm willing to look the other way because the series is so fucking good that I'm not going to let something like that completely derail the enjoyment for me. However, David, I do want to I want to say shenanigans on this because in an interview, they asked Tony Gilroy about why he replaced Jimmy Smits as Bail Organa. And he said, essentially, that when you're trying to bring back legacy characters, there are a lot of complications. And he mentioned specifically scheduling was an issue.
Yeah, and that could be.
It could be, but also this is Jimmy Smits, who's still alive, who's been a part of Star Wars since 2002.
Yes.
He has come back repeatedly for live action. You could say, okay, if you want to recast him, it's been 10 years. He's no longer really involved in Star Wars. He was in Obi-Wan a year and a half ago.
Yes.
That's what makes me mad, is that they couldn't wait for him because of scheduling conflicts. You couldn't wait for a legacy character. Now, I'm the one, David, who's always about recasting. I always say, well, if the character died, then recast. Or if the character is way too old, then recast. I've said we should have recast Luke.
Yeah.
We should have recast Han Solo.
Yeah.
If we weren't going to tell a proper story to fit their age, then we could have done something that continues a little more closely chronologically speaking to the original trilogy. But if you recast because of scheduling conflicts a legacy character, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. There's got to be another reason. Again, if we hadn't seen Jimmy Smits as Bail Organa since 2015, then I might shrug and say, well, that's a long time to bring someone in for a role that maybe lasted a minute or so. But we saw him in multiple episodes in Obi-Wan just 2 years ago. I don't like that. I don't mind recasting, but if a character was available just last week, wait for him. You couldn't have him come in for a half a day of shooting and get that scene done. Now, I might change my tune if we come back next week and we see that Bail Organa has a much bigger role. And then let's say Jimmy Smits was locked away on a set for a television show or a movie that he couldn't get away from, then I'd be more understanding. But if that was it and you put Benjamin Bratt in there, I'm a little about it.
That's what I think ultimately is why that actually happened. I actually believe that basically, we saw Bail briefly. I would say briefly. The amount of time that he was on screen was relatively brief for a character, but like we finally get to see him. I honestly think that the next 3 episodes, I'm expecting to see Bail more up front, which makes sense because that's one of the things that originally going into Andor, I was like going, well, characters like Mon Mothma and Bail Organa have to play a large role in the series because we know the Organas are also a major fixture of the rebellion. They're one of the major leaders, so it would make sense. To see Bail more. So does that mean we're going to get more Benjamin Bratt then? I think so. I think that's what we're going to get, and that's disappointing. I like Benjamin Bratt. Yeah. In fact, I think I've said years ago that it would be interesting to see because Jimmy Smits got really big off of those Mexican gangster films from the 80s. Yes. And growing up in the hood, Jimmy Smits was our idol. I'm just going to say it. He was. Growing up in high school and junior high, he was our idol. Oh, yeah. But,
I've said if Jimmy Smits were to ever return to his roots and do like this hardcore, like Latino gangster film, his brother could be Benjamin Bratt. I've said that before. Yeah. So it actually makes a lot of sense to cast him. But at the same time, you got to ask why.
But that's what I mean is like,
do you buy the scheduling conflict, David?
I will only buy it as if we see more of Benjamin Bratt then. If we see more of Bale, then it makes sense that basically say, oh, he couldn't fit into the schedule because they had a bigger time they needed for Bale to be there.
Your point is clear and I get it. So let's say it's scheduling and Benjamin Bratt was the only person that can come in and do multiple days of shooting because we're going to see more of Bail Organa. Okay, but should we also recast Diego Luna? Should we recast Skarsgård? Should we recast Genevieve O'Reilly if they weren't available? In my opinion, Bail Organa is just as important as those characters. And if Diego Luna or Genevieve O'Reilly said, well, I have a TV show that I'm doing right now, is he going to recast them? It seems weird not to wait for someone like Jimmy Smits, who is Bail Organa.
Yeah.
Maybe he wanted more money, but I don't see that. I don't see him being the one to say pass.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially if rumors are true and like if we do ever get another Obi-Wan series, he's going to be in it.
But at this point, do we want him in it or do we want Benjamin Bratt?
Exactly. Then? That's the problem that this creates.
Biggest thing is I want consistency.
Yeah.
If a character is going to play this character, let them play the fucking character and wait for them. That's how it works. That's the nature of television and film. If you want that character to play the role, you're going to have to make sure you schedule your production, your shoot schedule around their schedules. Did they not consider Jimmy Smits that important to the story? Or I should say Bail Organa. So overall, David, I mean, this show just did a great job getting into the nuances of not just politics and rebellion, but also fleshing things out. This series has done more for the cosmology of Star Wars than any movie we have been given in the Disney era, any series given to us in the Disney era. We have learned more about different species, different planets, technology, what they're doing in terms of the technologies we see and the functions of certain apparatuses. They're bridging the gap between things we've seen in live action form and animation, things we've seen in video games, things we've heard about in books, and bringing them together. There are things that I remember reading about in comic books in the 90s, David. Yeah. Some of the technology that we've never seen in live action, and now we're seeing them put into Andor. That's another thing that this series has done so well, and it says a lot about a man who professes not to be an uber fan of Star Wars. Tony Gilroy has said he never has considered himself a super hardcore fan of Star Wars. And this is an example, David, that you don't need a nerd like Favreau, Filoni, Leslie Headland. What's her name?
Leslie Headland.
The one that did Acolyte?
Acolyte.
These self-proclaimed fans who have done such subpar work in live action form. Whereas here's a guy who understands writing and quality. He doesn't need to know everything about Star Wars. That's what consultants will do. That's what the Lucas Story Group will do. And what we get is Andor seasons 1 and 2, a series that pushes the Star Wars mythos further than anything, I would even argue, than certain things Lucas has done.
Well, yeah, because like if you think about it, especially if now we don't know how he's going to close out season 2. However, the more we've gotten into Andor season 2, I am willing to say what Tony Gilroy has been able to do is something that a bunch of Star Wars creatives have attempted to do, is make a trilogy just as important and entertaining as the original trilogy. That says a lot, because like the new trilogy wished they could actually do what Andor was doing or is doing right now, just like what you said. They're expanding the universe. The new trilogy wished it could have done that. Instead, it was handled improperly because there was a lack of nuance and detail. Because I honestly think the more we've actually seen Star Wars as a franchise right now, people focus too much on the, superficial lightsabers, lasers, spaceships, legacy characters, all that stuff. Everyone seems to focus more on that instead of like, you have like Tony Gilroy come in who legitimately just says, no, I have a story that I'm trying to say, and I want to tie it to your franchise.
And David, he is borrowing the things from Lucas that work. Okay. Like he is maintaining dualities.
Mm-hmm.
He is, like I was saying at the beginning of the show, he's deconstructing those dualities, but he's still maintaining the necessity of binaries that encapsulate much of the framework of Star Wars. He's just using them differently. Then he also, David, is using those time gaps. Some of the biggest complaints we had about the sequel trilogy was that there's no time gaps between Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. And in doing that, it actually hinders the way you can tell your second film. That's the reason why we look back at the sequel trilogy and we all can come to the same consensus that a lot didn't happen. There's not a lot that actually happened.
Yes.
Because they didn't allow time to pass. The genius of Lucas, that something that he's done since day one, is that in between every movie, there's a substantial amount of time that has gone by. Essentially, what that allows is a bit of an organic or natural break in time. And what happens in reality, what happens when time goes by? We change, our thoughts change.
Yes.
We've had a moment to think about what had transpired. And in doing so, you get to cheat a bit because you get to have character development that you didn't have to see.
Exactly, because it forces the audience to come up with the gaps in their own minds.
Right. And it allows you to tell a more expansive story.
Yes.
That is what's always fascinated me about the first 6 Star Wars films.
Oh, yeah.
Those time gaps, there's so much there. What Gilroy's doing, he's essentially borrowing that strategy and giving us those time breaks in between his story arcs that actually allows him to do more than just what traditionally 12 episodes would let him do. He's actually giving us, in narrative terms, I'm not speaking, of course, in episodic terms, he's giving us a story that actually fits 20 plus episodes.
Yes.
He's just cutting away the fat. If he didn't give us those time gaps, he would have to have episodes to explain how character A got to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
How did character B get to this moment? Instead, he gives us the time gap and explain introspectively, like he did with Vel and Cinta. Perfect. And also Bix. Bix, now we get, has been struggling for over 2 years of trauma. If this was being told in real time.
Yes.
Oh, really? 6 episodes and she's fine now? But instead, we're like, she's been suffering for years.
For years.
David.
For years.
For years.
Yeah.
That's so much more impactful. And that wouldn't have worked if we didn't have time gaps.
It's the difference between, honestly, a good writer and a bad writer. A bad writer feels that he has to cover all his bases, so there's no wiggle room, right? A good writer knows I can make my story count simply by showing the action or having a simple line, one line. But a bad writer will go, I need an entire chapter to explain my character's thought process.
Look at New Hope. Between New Hope and Empire.
Oh, yeah. That's my favorite example.
In Empire, we clearly understand that between the time gap, Luke was being trained by Obi-Wan.
Yes.
That's why he can be who he was in Empire. the character change in Han Solo only worked in Empire because time had passed. He had been working with the rebellion. He had developed a type of empathy for the cause. He understood it better.
Yeah, you start seeing the inklings that he has a relationship with Leia. That
relationship with Leia would not have worked if there wasn't a time gap. We wouldn't have believed in their love. So the ending that we got, the tragedy, wouldn't have worked. We wouldn't have cared that he got locked away in carbonite because we wouldn't have believed their affection for each other because time didn't pass. That's why with Star Wars, the time aspects have always worked. And that's why I always say, when you are a good writer, you know what you can throw out and what you should probably maintain when you're dealing within an established IP. That brings us right back to what I was talking about at the very top of the show. Tony Gilroy continually puts on display his understanding, not of just writing, but of Star Wars, not necessarily the cosmology, although he understands that as well, meaning canon. He understands the narrative functions that Lucas used for Star Wars, and he utilizes the very same narrative functions. That's why this series works. That's why this series feels more like Star Wars, even though it's more mature, it's morally ambiguous at times, and yet it feels like an authentic piece of Star Wars.
Yeah. And that's the amazing thing about this series.
Whereas, again, I'm going to point to Acolyte because it's the most.
It's the most recent.
I don't want people thinking, and maybe this is a bad thing. We might have Star Wars fans who want to shoot us. I don't hate Acolyte.
Yeah.
But the problems with Acolyte are clearly that the people that wrote it don't understand writing for television, number one, and they don't understand Star Wars as well as they thought they did.
Yeah. Well, they don't understand storytelling too. Because, like, if you try to force things, and it's something that me and you have always hearkened at with all the shows that me and you have covered, as a writer, if you try to force your ideas or your ideology on the audience, all you're going to do is ruin your narrative because you're taking away from the narrative.
Yeah. We also saw Saw Gerrera.
My God,
they bringing God, dude. So Forrest Whitaker is just
my ghost dog.
Well, yes, that's Jim Jarmusch's film Ghost Dog is. I think if you're a film nerd, it's amazing.
It's amazing.
Hey, it's part of the Wu-Tang classics.
Yes, it is.
I think it's on RZA's top 10 like kung fu films or something like that.
No,
it's a silly movie, but it's also incredibly smart in its own way.
Yes.
But Forrest Whitaker is just a talent that he has been given his due at times. But overall, if you look at his career, he just doesn't get enough credit. And when Forrest Whitaker came onto the scene for me in a really big way, was yes, Ghost Dog was fantastic in the 90s. But the TV series that really showed me how great he was is actually FX's The Shield.
Yes.
He was on for 2 seasons. He had an amazing story arc. I couldn't believe the amount of acting that this guy did in that series.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic. And since then, since 2000, and when did that series air? Like 2002, 2003? Since then, I have made it a point to always watch everything Forrest Whitaker
Same
did.
here. Yes.
He is so good. And I love to see a writer and directors like the ones on Andor allowing this man to do what he does.
Well, think about this too, Mike. I mean, we also talked about how one of the issues in a lot of stories regarding prequels, bringing back older actors to play a younger role of them, can majority of the time not look very well. But this shows what I've always been telling people about some of the most underrated actors, in my opinion, out there. Forrest Whitaker is out there because he should be playing a younger role than he was originally shown. And it doesn't really go through audiences' minds that how old he is.
But Saw Gerrera, I mean, Forrest Whitaker doesn't age. I mean, the guy has looked the same for the past, 20 years. He looks the same.
And like, that's what I mean is like why these 3 episodes have really, really stuck with me the most, because like one of my favorite actors of all time is showing again why he's so damn good. And it still baffles my mind. You mean to tell me that no one really goes to Forrest Whitaker for a lot of work? Look what the guy can do.
Yeah, he's very good. I did like that they're trying to bridge this connection. They do need to do that. Like, how did Saw Gerrera go from this guy that didn't need a breathing apparatus to needing a breathing apparatus in Rogue One?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we now see that he's addicted to inhaling, or at least maybe not addicted yet, but he was inhaling the toxic fumes of the Rymodian. Is that what it is? Is that what they were calling it?
The Rymodian.
The Rymodian, which is basically a fuel for spacecrafts, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that moment, to me, those are the moments that make Emmys possible. When he looks at the other character, he says, "You think I'm crazy?" I am crazy.
I am crazy.
Rebellion makes you crazy. I fucking love his performance.
I do.
It's so good.
Yeah. It's so
I
awesome.
want more of him.
Yeah.
I want, before this series ends, I don't have a lot of wants, because in a show like this, I kind of just sit back and enjoy it. But I want to see Saw Gerrera just go to town on some Imperials.
Oh, absolutely. I think
we have to see at least one barbaric scene where he takes the lead, right?
Where he takes the lead, because like, I think, especially knowing this character and how this character has really grown with me as a Star Wars fan, because like when you see the progression of how he starts
from Clone Wars
to
good.
Rebels to here, then to Rogue One. And it's like, it is one of the most underrated, tragic stories of all Star Wars characters, because like the fact that he starts, number one, losing his sister, and then he gets obsessed with wanting to kill as many of like the people who killed his sister, but then it switches to, I have to kill all the Imperials because how dare they, we have to start this rebellion. And then you get to here where he's just insane. And he's like, that whole scene had me captivated, because I'm like, this is what I needed to see to really form the character arc of Saw Gerrera. Why is he so dangerous? Well, this is why. And yeah, I agree with you. I think it would be so awesome. This is a fan want, honestly, right at this point. But I want to see Saw Gerrera at his most barbaric, when he's confronted with a bunch of Imperials and there's no mercy in him. He just goes crazy and just kills people. And then that will be the capstone of like, yeah, this is what happens to a guy who becomes so obsessed and he becomes so crazed that he loses his humanity at this point. And that's why it makes the story in Rogue One even better, because like, we also have to throw in the fact that Jin is the one thing that kind of, it's alluded to, that basically saw Jin as the last bits of his humanity. And that's why, he's willing to listen to her in the in Rogue One. She's the only one that he's willing to listen to. And like when essentially they have to do an impasse and she leaves, it almost is like that tragic thing where Saw is like left alone and then he dies on that planet. And it's like, oh, there's the perfect capstone for that character.
Yeah. Overall, the episode worked just fine for me. I pretty much enjoy and love everything from beginning to end. There's only one small complaint, David, and it's the handling of Vel's death. Which one's Vel? Hold on. I wish I could get their name. I understand what the writers were doing with this, and ultimately it does work. We understand what the point of that scene was. And it's just to sow those seeds of tragedy and this idea of miscommunication and how rebels factions form, their disagreements, everything we went through. But if this was any other show, David, that wasn't operating at this peak level, we would probably spend 20 minutes shitting on you bringing back a character only for you to kill them. That's a bit weak, in my opinion. I feel like she probably, yes, we saw her for a moment, but she has been kind of MIA. She hasn't had the biggest role since the opening, 4 episodes of the first season. She's been kind of gone.
Yeah.
And for the most part, we get that because it's not about her, really. The story is more about Vel, at least when it comes to two of them. And everything about Cinta is not really about Cinta. It's about Vel. So in looking at it from that perspective, them killing Cinta the way they did makes sense because you're focusing on Vel. She's the story at that moment. But I feel like they probably should have brought back that rekindling maybe an episode prior, or at least 2 episodes prior, because the way they did it, it feels weak. They bring it in, have them rekindle so we can remember the romance. Let's ratchet up the emotions and then end it. That feels a little overly contrived. And that's something that Gilroy and his team are not guilty of very often. I think this is probably the only moment that I can point to and say that's a bit of a foul ball there.
Well, here's the thing, though, is like it goes with the theme of what Gilroy is posing in about Andor is like the cost of rebellion is very messy, and anything can happen that will go wrong. I mean, I like the fact that one of the things I really liked about the death was like, yeah, it happened suddenly, but it was an accident. It wasn't like on purpose. She was shot by accident by people who weren't experienced enough to understand, number one, how to fight, and number two, they don't really know. They just get thrown into the rebellion, and that inexperience causes chaos, and chaos usually lends to tragedy.
Yes, and I'll buy it. You sold me. I don't hate it, David. I'm just saying that if you look at it from one perspective, it doesn't quite work. But if you look at it from your perspective, it works much better. Also, if you look at this as ultimately an agenda of disillusionment, if that's the point of these 3 episodes in a lot of ways,
yes,
then that does work because we are now having, or I should say the rebels themselves, as well as the viewer, are now having to confront what Luthen's utilitarianism actually means for the individual. So as a group, we might win. Vel might survive, but that doesn't mean the people she loves will survive with her. That's the downside of utilitarianism, because consequentialism is essentially about the greater good. So you can shoot someone in the face if you're going to save millions of people. So the moral value, the moral worth at times is placed on the end result. Now, there are different forms of utilitarianism. Another form of utilitarianism is based on its intentions. If your intentions were good, then Luthen's actions were good, even though it ended in travesty. Then there's another version. Your intentions mean shit. The end is what matters. If the end can be deemed morally good, then your utilitarian actions is morally right. Which I think that's the perspective you were going with, David, when it comes to Vel and Cinta. And that makes perfect sense. If that is the point, for Vel to have to confront Luthen's strategies, and what if she finds out that Andor was sent first?
Yes.
And Andor said, bad idea. These people are inexperienced. They are not ready for this level. Andor was very clear. He knew within 5 minutes that these people were not ready to be brought in.
Yeah.
And what did Luthen do? He said, well, if the failure what do you say? Like, even if we fail, the planet will shine brightly.
Will shine brightly.
So he didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't care if by bringing the Gorman people into the rebellion, it didn't matter to him whether or not they themselves would fall. What it mattered to him was what would be the ending message.
Yes.
As they burn under Imperial rule, the rest of the galaxy will see what the Empire did to Gorman. So in that way, all of these actions are justified in Luthen's eyes. And if that's the point between Vel and Cinta, that disillusionment, tragedy goes hand in hand with utilitarian thought, then I'm better with it. Although I still stand by the idea that they probably could have handled that particular aspect a little bit better.
A little bit better, but like also to throw that in there, I like the fact that Vel didn't like automatically lash out and kill. I think it's Sam that shoots Cinta, because it's kind of like you get to actually see that conflict because Cinta knows these guys are inexperienced and it was an accident. So she doesn't automatically lash out and just kill everybody.
I was hoping she did. Vel, you mean? Vel?
I think if Vel did that, then I would lean towards you, where it's like, yeah, that's bad writing because like, okay, so she just lashes out and kills someone. Instead, you actually show that conflict where Cinta knows she was sent here on a mission. And a part of her is trained to know bad shit's gonna happen. And the fact that the cost for her is Cinta, and like she can't immediately just turn on this guy who's inexperienced, doesn't know how to use a freaking blaster, and expect him to be a level head in a gunfight. And it's like, I like the fact that Tony Gilroy makes these characters not. When I see someone do that, where they lash out automatically and like emotionally, it's very melodramatic and one-dimensional to me. Instead, taking this route makes them feel more complex and more, I guess you could say, real, because a real person is going to actually have to think about what this action means to them. It's not an instant animalistic reaction. It's not based on emotion. There's some thought behind it, you know? And that's why I said is like, if Vel lashed out and just murdered everybody for killing Cinta, then I would be like with you and say, no, this is bad writing. To me, I like this because it made the whole scene and the whole context of the series of Andor that much more complex. It's like these characters can't be, just like what you said throughout the show, you can't be one side or the other. It's all muddied together. There's a lot of dirtiness in war.
Yeah. All right, so let's close out our discussion. We're not really giving ratings this year because they're just bunched up in 3 episodes. I think at the end of the season, we'll give our final grade. But so far, just to give people a general idea of how we feel about these, I would say they average in the low 90s to mid 90s so far. Very strong episodes with fantastic character development, world building in ways that we have not seen in years for Star Wars. It's a series that's really working for me on multiple levels. As a television critic, as a television fan, as a fan of Star Wars, this is the first Star Wars series that I can enjoy on all 3 fronts.
Yeah, same here.
All right, David, any final thoughts you want to add?
Final thoughts is, God, I want Deidre as my wife.
Those are my final thoughts. And if she's my wife, how can she be yours? So stupid. Later.
May the Force be with us.
Ah, yes.